Thank you so much for coming out here today. My name is Antonia Iyer. I'm an analyst with the Early Childhood Initiatives Division. For our next session, we are excited to have Dr. August Hamilton, Principal of Educational Initiatives for Concentric Community Advisors. Dr. Hamilton's work focuses on socially equitable investments in affordable housing, education, and food access. With a background in PK through 12 education and leadership, he works on innovative housing solutions for educators and expanding access to early childhood programs through public-private partnerships. Dr. Hamilton holds degrees from Princeton, Rice, and the University of Texas at Austin. So if you could all give Dr. Hamilton a round of applause.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I hate to be the session between now and lunch. But work with me here. No, I'm glad to be here this morning. I'm actually honored to be here. Just a quick survey of the room. How many of you work directly with kids in an early childhood setting? Raise your hands. Awesome. Thank you for what you do. That's the work, and so appreciate that. How many of you are in nonprofits or spaces like that supporting the work? Excellent. All right, excellent. How many of you work in local government, city, county? Anyone here? Awesome. Thank you for being here. Any private sector individuals in the space? Okay, that works. Yeah, excellent. That works. Okay. Hey, that's all right. Well, I'm just so glad and to see the spectrum and the spectrum of individuals in this room, because that's what's going to take for us to be able to address the housing and the housing affordability crisis we have in this country and what we have here in Harris County and in Houston, Texas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. My time is really going to focus on the intersection of three things: housing stability, early childhood education, and housing affordability. Now, I could spend the next 3 days talking about these things, but I'm going to try to give a very high-level overview of how these things intertwine. A little bit about myself, though, before I get started. I started as a 6th grade math teacher at Stevenson Middle School by Hobby Airport, if any of you are familiar with Stevenson. Was a campus administrator at Jack Yates Senior High School, and worked in Houston ISD 13 years, all the way up to being the district chief of staff at one point. And so this intersection of education and housing is very dear to my heart, and so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share with you today. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to take a second and think to yourself, when you think of the concept of home, what does home mean to you? What does home mean to you? As you think about that, I want you to ponder on that as we go through this presentation, because what we're talking about is home, right? I'm going to get into some finance a little bit, I'll get into some numbers, but at its core, what I'm talking about is what home is. Just a few statistics to share with you all, and you all are in the work, you've seen it, you probably know these better than I do even, but since 2020, we've seen a 21% decrease in the number of child care centers in Harris County, with nearly 17,000 families on wait lists, right? So this talks about the child care shortage we have. The percentage of Harris County parents who are reporting difficulty in affording basic needs, including housing, food, and shelter, has increased from 39% to 57%, right? Right now, we're in this period of time where people are struggling to get by. While home prices have increased in Harris County, buying power has not. The affordability gap, which is that gap between how much people earn and how much it costs to live in a home, has increased over 275% in Harris County and 54% in Houston. Recent study shows that the majority of households in Harris County are not affordable to a family earning $100,000 a year or less. Right? So we have a real issue, and we're facing it right now. And so one thing I also want you to think about, and I'm going to kind of move through this presentation to skip some stuff just to make sure there's time for questions, is how are you seeing housing stability impact your day-to-day operations and the work that you're in? right? Because these things are real and these things are happening right now. So really my aim of this session is to give some data to these numbers and to give you some real life market data that our firm has access to. Just a little bit about our firm, Concentric Community Advisors I work at. Currently, we're in the affordable housing, mixed income housing space. So we finance and help finance the transactions that actually happen. So when it comes to the capital, the debt, the equity involved in transactions, that's what we do. But it goes directly to the root of affordability. So I'm gonna use some of the data from our work, but to also talk about early childhood. My first love is education, and so talking about how the two things are intertwined through key data and trends, what housing stability and instability is and how it impacts the development of young minds, some of the barriers we currently face when it comes to affordable housing, and what are some of the current solutions and successes we're seeing. And then I want to save time for questions, and so I'm going to try to move through this quickly, like skipping that slide. Okay. Understanding housing instability. For a lot of people, when they think of housing instability, they think about homelessness. And yes, homelessness is the ultimate form of instability, but what you'll see here on the spectrum is that instability and housing instability is a spectrum, right? Right, from being stably, affordably housed to being homeless. And what we see in our communities is a lot of families are somewhere on this spectrum, whether it's increasing housing and cost burden is making it harder for them to pay their bills, pay their rent, right? Whether they're having to move in with family members because they can't afford to live on their own, whether it's eviction, whether it's moving from unit to unit trying to find monthly concessions that they can find a free month's rent at a place to live in. Those are the realities of what's happening, and the indicators of that and what we can see and what we measure are things like cost burden, right? When we look at federal definitions of cost burden, it says that if you're spending more than 30% of your monthly income on housing, then you're cost burdened. The reality is what we see in Harris County and honestly most urban areas in America is a lot of families are spending 50% or more of their monthly income to afford housing. Overcrowding, this is when multiple families are living in the same unit, right? You may have 2 or 3 families sharing a 2 or 3 bedroom unit just to get by. Eviction risk, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that being forced out because of your inability to pay. There's frequent movement, homelessness, that's that failure of the system in order to make sure that we can provide a safe place for all of our families to live. And so understanding it exists on a spectrum. I'm gonna kind of skip through playing this clip, but it's a great clip if you have a chance to listen to it. But there was a study in the journal Pediatrics. It was a 20-year longitudinal study. They just released this past year, so it's kind of exciting. But what they looked at was the relationship between young children and housing instability. And what they found is that, they studied kids from birth to age 15. What they found was that kids who faced any level of housing insecurity at any point had poor overall health at age 15. So there's a direct correlation between housing stability and child health. Children who experienced housing insecurity suffered from depression, had those with severe housing insecurity had increased anxiety. These health effects were real, right? And so what this journal article and, what this story from NPR talks about is some interventions that were done in California, in Los Angeles specifically, and Skid Row, to help those families and by using pediatric visits as a way to screen for housing insecurity and to be able to directly get an understanding of what children were going through so that the county and city could intervene. And I think this is a powerful tool because as educators, as people in the space, there are very few people who are in front of kids every day. And there are very few people who have a contact point to families in our community to really get information. Early childhood providers are one of those people, right? And the earlier we intervene, the earlier and easier it is to find solutions to these problems. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And for those of you who aren't, just real quick, right? Physiological needs, safety needs. What Maslow was trying to do was he was trying to say that, hey, for a kid to reach a level of self-actualization, to be able to meet their maximum potential in life, there's a series of needs they have to have met on a hierarchy, right? At the base, it's physiological needs, right? And housing security, that shelter is a physiological need. When you have stable shelter, then you can feel safe. Then families can go somewhere and have employment and have a safe place to come back to. They're able to earn revenue. They're able to earn money so they can live in their homes. When you have that, then you can develop sense of love and belonging, sense of family. You develop that esteem. You develop that self-actualization. And the reason this is so important is because young children of anyone, they spend the most time at home, right? So housing instability affects children fundamentally almost differently than adults because of the amount of time they have to spend at home. So they're especially prone to those negative impacts and effects. And so what I did here on this slide is I pulled a couple, these are all from the research literature about the relationship between stable housing and steady learning. And so what you'll see here is cognitively, right, if a child has stable housing, they're consistently learning, they're supporting that cognitive growth. When you don't have stable housing, those disruptions hinder cognitive growth, right? When the kid can't stay in the same classroom, when their curriculum is changing month after month, it doesn't lead to strong cognitive development, right? From school readiness perspectives, especially in early childhood, when we talk about literacy and math skills, right, and the inconsistency when you don't have consistent access to stable housing, and it's not just being given care by a provider, but it's about what your family and what your parent is able to provide to you as a kid, right? When you're dealing with housing instability, there are certain stressors that are fundamentally prevent the opportunity for you to be able to get that school readiness. Some of you may be familiar with Hart and Rosalie's study called the 30 million word gap, and I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but in 30 million word gap, basically it says by age 3, children who grow up in situations of poverty have heard 30 million less words than their partners who are, or their peers who are in higher income neighborhoods, right? That's a direct correlation to when you have that housing stability. So you can kind of see in this chart, and I won't go through everything, how it directly impacts that social, emotional, and the mental learning that kids get and go through. Here's some interesting facts also about housing instability in Houston. And this was done by Understanding Houston, a great organization, a lot of great data. They did a survey of Houston homes. In 2023, 8,900 homes did not have complete plumbing systems, right? 17,000 homes did not have kitchens. So when we talk about health and safety of our young children, right, when you don't have those things, that directly correlates to housing instability. In 2023, there were 84,000 eviction filings. Right? This is compared to pre-pandemic total of 58,000. So more and more families, because of rising prices, are being pushed out of our neighborhoods, right? Homelessness, and I think this is a major success of the city of Houston, right? And I'll talk a little bit about this. 63% drop in homelessness across the city of Houston between 2011 and 2024. And I'll talk a little bit about what those efforts were to make that happen. But I will caveat that with saying, a great deal of that work was funded through federal ARPA dollars, right? And so now we're at an interesting place when we talk about our homeless response and homeless response system. It's funny because I had no idea what the first panelists they were going to talk about this morning, but I think this slide directly correlates to that because we're going to get into a conversation about housing finance here, right? And having lived in Houston the last 15 years, right, you live it. But I was seeing this on paper, like, it made me think, like, oh, yeah, we have been through a lot, right? Between 1983 and 2024, FEMA has declared a natural disaster in Houston 26 times, right? 8 natural disasters have occurred since 2015. Why this matters for housing? One big reason it matters. In Houston, and especially when you go to our outlying communities, when you think of like the A-Leafs, when you think of the Pasadenas, right? We have a very large naturally occurring affordable housing stock, which is a lot of housing stock that was built in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's affordable because it was built such a long time ago, right? But those are often located in the most climate risky areas. And so when we have these natural disasters, we lose that housing stock, right? And so where do those families go, right? And they often end up in that housing instability spectrum, right? And so from a finance perspective, one of the big factors we think about is insurance costs. And if any of you own a home, you've seen it over the course of the last year, and you're going to see it going forward. In fact, in Houston, there's a lot of places now that they won't insure you. You can't get home insurance in Houston. So when we talk about the price of housing, that insurance cost increases the price to develop. And we're a dense city. We don't have much available land. And the reason I mention that is because if those of you who think about and who are involved with flood planning, as we see our 500-year floodplain become our 100-year floodplain, and you think about the requirements to build on that, we have less and less space to actually build new housing, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. Houston is still, today, second in the United States for projected net migration. What does that mean? Of every city in the United States, we're number 2 in terms of the number of people moving into our city, despite everything I just said on the last slide. Right? They don't know. Right? They haven't been here. They don't know. Right? And so I show you this chart because I think this is a really powerful example, and this is going to get at the core of what we're talking about, and I'm going to watch my time here. This chart is from December 2013, for those of you who can't see it, to February 2025. This is market data that we use when we run financial analysis. What we're showing here on this y-axis, coming back to my 6th grade math, on the y-axis here, we have the effective rental price. This is the average price of a unit across what we call Class A, Class B, Class C, right? Across every unit class, this is our average price. In black line, going this way, that's our the black line is the effective price. These bars are occupancy, right? So what percentage of the units within a particular complex are filled? And this is multifamily, right? So what you see is, right, we have these high occupancy moments, then we have these kind of dips, right? Occupancy increases, it dips, right? Occupancy increases, it dips. Despite that, our prices are continuing to increase. What does that mean, right? And I'll break this down here. We built a lot, and those of you who live in the city have seen this, in the last couple of years, especially on the luxury side of housing, we have built a lot of units in these last couple of years. The reason why? Well, we were dealing with almost 0% interest rates, right? So developers were ready to build, and they were able and they were willing to build. The money made sense. It made sense. So they built. When they built, what does that do? It increases the number of available units. So it decreases occupancy. However, those of you who have loans, credit card debt, see it every month. Because of interest rates going up, people aren't building right now. And what happens is, and most of our clients who build, it takes between 24 to 36 months to plan a project and then to move in tenants. We're in this really unique position right now because we have a lot of units, we have low occupancy, but they built 3 years ago because they knew people were coming here, right? These projects, oftentimes $70, $80 million, they do their planning before. Problem is right now, no one's building anymore. So we're expecting, and because people aren't building, this is why price goes up. It's a supply and demand thing. We don't have enough units, people are still coming, and we're building, and it's pushing up our housing prices, right? And so it's making not only home ownership unattainable for a lot of people, but it's pushing out a lot of renters. And that's a trend that Houston has historically been affordable, and we're still much more affordable than a lot of other metro areas. But this is a little bit different. And so that slowdown in construction, I think you're going to see over the next couple of years, this housing crisis that we have, right? We're going to have to get some really creative solutions in order to get to an answer. The Kinder Institute does great analysis on data on housing. This is just from their recent study that they did about the reality of housing costs in Houston. They asked 3 core questions. The first question was, in the last 12 months, and this was to a survey of Houstonians, last 12 months, how difficult was it for you to afford your housing costs? 60% of people surveyed said they had some level of difficulty in affording their housing costs. For those who reported difficulty, which were the following were the contributing factors? The biggest ones were high utility bills. If you've seen electric bills, your CenterPoint raised rates recently. If you've seen your water bill, you've probably seen that go up, right? It's going up everywhere. A lot of our families, especially those teetering on the edge of housing instabilities, this really impacts them. Severe weather events, we've already talked about that, right? Another big one is the economy. And we're seeing that this economy is becoming more and more difficult. I'm not going to go into a political rant, but I will just say, right, there's a lot more difficulty in the economy than we've seen in past years. So when we talk about housing instability, we have to take those things into account. Lastly, how worried are you about being priced out of your home due to rent, mortgage, or property taxes increases over the next year? 62% of those surveyed are worried, right? I share this not to share doom and gloom, but to share that, right, we have a problem, and it's not a future problem, we have a now problem, right, when it comes to housing affordability. And so this part of the presentation, y'all ride with me here, I'm gonna get a little bit into the numbers, but I think it's important because I think for everyone to kind of understand a fundamental question, which is, and the question I get all the time is like, why can't we build more housing, right? And it's a complex answer. Some of it's political, right? But a lot of it comes down to the numbers. And one thing I will say, and my clients hate me for saying this, most people who build housing are not building housing to do social good. They're building housing because they're trying to get a return on investment to their equity and make sure they can pay their debt off, right? So when we talk about housing affordability, we have to understand what are those factors that are really impacting how people approach this work. Right? Demand, we talked about it. People are moving here all the time. Supply, we talked about it. We're losing our naturally occurring affordable housing supply, and it's hard to rebuild here, so our supply is dwindling. Hard construction costs, this is huge. Some of you may have heard the news yesterday about tariffs, and I will tell you that is going to have a direct impact on housing affordability in this country. And that's just that. But we're also talking about labor costs, right? We're talking about labor costs and the ability to find labor that's able to build housing, right? We're talking about electricians, we're talking about plumbers, we're talking about roofers. All of those things, we're running low on them, and we're putting policies into place that are making it more difficult for people to be able to do this work. Soft development costs, where we talk about permitting and zoning and impact studies, all those things fall into that. Funding availability. For those of you, when we talk about affordable housing, you may be familiar with what we call low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC. That's the biggest source of affordable housing equity in the country, right? Like, LIHTC funding is a federal program. As we've seen in every other federal program over the last couple of weeks, that's also at stake, right? So for a lot of our low-income housing, we have an issue here. Land cost. This is the number one cost in housing and building a project. It is the cost of the land and the availability of land. Inside of the loop of city, of any metro area, inside of any city, the cost of land is the most expensive. However, the way in which we've historically redlined our communities and built certain communities right next to freeways intentionally, and now it's coming back because everyone wants to be in the center and the core of communities, and we're now pricing out and gentrifying out communities. That's all a function of what we've historically set up, and now yet we're not able to address. So those are the types of things. Land costs are important. Interest rates, I talked about that already. That's huge. Federal and state regulations. It'll be really interesting to see how this administration approaches the housing situation from a federal level, because one thing to note, and if I hadn't mentioned this, the state of Texas provides $0 out of its general revenue budget to support the construction of housing. Almost all housing in the United States, and especially in Texas, right, low-income housing is built through federal subsidies, through LIHTC equity, and through philanthropy, right? And then the rest is left to the market. So when we talk about federal regulations changing, that has a really big impact on housing affordability. So this is my most wordy slide, and I said I was not going to do this, but I did it. And so I'm going to go over this at a very high level, but I think if there's anything to take away, this is the most critical thing to take away about why housing seems and why housing is inaffordable today. So I'll start with this. Down here in green, if you notice these markers here, it says AMI. AMI stands for Area Median Income. Area median income is determined by statistical area. The federal government has what they call MSAs, or metropolitan statistical areas. And so basically Houston, Woodlands, Sugarland is a MSA. And so basically they take the median income of everyone who lives in the area, and they do it by number of individuals in the household. So in Harris County, for a family of 4, the median income at 120% of median income is $113,520. So that's for people living in a household. And the reality is, for a household, that's not that big of a salary. And that's 120% of AMI. 80% of AMI is $75,680 for a household of 4. These are 4 people living in a household. 50% of AMI is $47,300. That's for 4 people living in a household. 30% of AMI is for $28,380 for 4 people in a household in Harris County. Recent Kinder survey says that you can't afford to live in Harris County if you earn under $75,000 a year. So let's put this into perspective, right? right? So I spend a lot of my time between multiple types of clients, and a lot of them are large private developers, right, who are in it purely to make a return and make money. However, they think about this equation at the bottom the same way that our nonprofit developer friends think about this equation, which is that for a project to what they call pencil, or to make sense, the amount of money you earn from a project minus how much it costs for you to operate. Let's think it's apartment complex, to actually pay for it, operate it, pay for the land, pay your debt back that you borrowed to get on the project, has to equal a positive number. When that number is positive, you can get a return on your project, you can pay your investors back, and you can build over and over again. When that number is negative, right, then that means that you got to find some money somewhere to make it happen, and people usually don't like doing projects that don't return money, right? And this is what happens, right, when you have a free market kind of deciding how you're going to build and affordability. But the reality is that, like, and this is the tough part about it, for an average unit to be built, you can build at market rate probably around $200,000 a door. So, like, if you think about a 300-unit apartment complex, you're talking about $60 million is needed to build that, right? When we talk about our affordable housing, it actually costs more to build affordable housing because of the federal regulations and requirements aligned with it. For our affordable housing, it's about $300,000 a door. So it takes me about, I can build a 100-unit supportive housing complex for about $30 million. That's 100 units for $30 million. It's hard to do. And it's hard to do because you're not getting income because, right, the people there are earning money or else they wouldn't be in this income bracket, right? And so you're really dependent on federal grants. You're dependent on local philanthropy. You're dependent on subsidies from your local jurisdiction to build. And this is why our deeply affordable units, the ones that we have the most need for, are the hardest to build. Because there are very few developers who can pull this off because it requires a lot of support and a lot of help. At this end, right, I can take out equity. I can get investors for a $70 million project. Usually they're talking about 60% of it is in debt and 40% is in equity. So, like, I can go and borrow $35 million. I can go raise the other $35 million and give a return. That's why you keep seeing this getting built, right? Because it's easy to do. And so I share that because when we talk about subsidy, when we talk about what it takes to build housing, right, to support those who we need to support the most, it requires a high level of intervention and support from sources outside of just the goodwill of developers. We need grants, we need philanthropy, we need subsidy, because that's just where we are, and how we build things. And I'll say this, and I always think about this from my own background. In the United States, we do things opposite than the rest of the world. When it comes to education in the rest of the world, education is highly centralized, right? So like there are national standards, right? There are national, every school kind of has the same systems for pay and so on and so forth. In the United States, we're highly decentralized, right? We give it to states. We say, you determine what you're gonna do, what standards you wanna teach, so on and so forth. In other countries, and the reasons they don't have the same affordability crisis we do, is that they take the opposite approach when it comes to housing. And the housing in America, we are highly centralized, right? Either the federal government gives you money to pay for low-income housing, or you let the market handle it. Whereas in other countries, the federal government pays for housing, and so it flips the equation, right? That's why we have a unique affordability crisis at this period in time, right? It's the roles in which government plays when it comes to housing. And so I will end with like these couple of, because I know I'm running low on time, these 5 kind of pillars that I think about when we think about what does it take to address this housing crisis. And I will start by saying I don't have all the answers, right? I give examples of what we've seen work and what we could possibly scale in order to make our housing crisis maybe get it to a more realistic place where it needs to be to meet the needs of families. Nationally, and this is nationally, for about every 100 extremely low income households, those earning below 30% of AMI, only 35 affordable units exist, right? We have a supply problem, right? We are not building enough at the other end of the spectrum. And you're gonna ask the perfect follow-up question, which is, well, how are we supposed to do that if you said that it takes a lot of money to build? Well, there's a twofold approach, right? One thing to think about is density, the density in which we build. Interesting fact, and I stay in this a lot, we have, and I couldn't believe this when I read this, in the United States, we have almost 40 million extra bedrooms. What I mean by 40 million extra bedrooms is that we built these very large houses, single-family homes on lots, 3, 4, sometimes 5 bedrooms, for a very different generation, a very, very different time when families were much larger. Today, with declining birth rates and smaller families, we have a lot of extra bedrooms in this country. However, they take up lots and they take up land that we need to build housing if we're gonna build affordable housing. Part of that is increasing density and using duplexes, triplexes, right? Putting in accessory, we call them ADUs, different ways that we can add variety to our housing supply to meet the needs of families. I want to talk about stable and predictable housing costs. One thing, if you're in the housing space and if you deal with families, you've probably heard of Section 8 and vouchers, right? And just as just a little bit of historical context, back in the 1940s, post-World War II, the United States invested in public housing, which was actually building facilities, right, and apartment complexes that looked like army barracks because they were actually built by the same engineers who built army barracks, right, to house low-income families. Then in the 1980s, they switched to a program called Section 8, in which they said, hey, we as the federal government aren't gonna build housing anymore. We're just gonna give people vouchers that they can use to go and live in existing housing developments, right? However, what we've seen, and we know that vouchers work, right? Like, data shows like reductions in the number of people living in crowded housing, right? Reduced homelessness, reduced frequency of movement, right? We know it works, but the problem is the federal government has not invested enough in that program. So as rents have increased, the number of vouchers have decreased. decreased, right? Because what's fair market rent is increasing, but the subsidy investment hasn't increased. And so less families are able to use vouchers, right? And so Harris County actually did something great during COVID with its emergency rental assistance program. Those are the type of direct investments we need in communities and in families, right? In order to give more housing security to a lot of our families. Housing support services, the county has and also has done a great job of providing this. And we have organizations in this community who do a great job of providing eviction prevention and legal assistance. What I will say about that, I'll say two things. First of all, there was a spike in evictions because a lot of federal protections that had been provided during COVID were no longer required when COVID ended. And so a lot of families were, without due process, getting pushed out of their homes by property owners. Right? And so having that legal assistance and the county's support and helping promote that and invest in that has been critical. The other thing is, interesting fact, in Texas, source of income discrimination is legal, right? And so what I mean by that is that if you come to, and I should have said this in the last slide, if you go to an apartment complex and there are two people, one carrying a voucher and one not carrying a voucher for the same unit, they have the right, ownership has the right to deny the person with the voucher. Right? And so these are the type of policies, right, that impact housing and housing support. But going back to homelessness, the Way Home Initiative here in the county was it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways and became a national model. It was this huge collaboration between the county, the city, local nonprofits, right? It took a housing first approach, right? They took homeless individuals, put them in housing first, and then provided them the social services to be able to solve issues after. Those are the types of programs that we need to invest in for our families in homelessness and most at risk. You saw in the Kinder survey, utility and emergency expense assistance, the ways in which we can involve that. And with this federal funding going away, right, we actually heard, and if you pay attention, I pay attention to education a lot. In education, we called it ESSER, right, or ESSER funds. Well, last week, the Department of Education rescinded all unspent ESSER funds. So you have districts who were waiting and planning to spend hundreds of millions of dollars who now have zero, and they took it away without saying anything, right? And so these types of programs, right, it's going to be on local government and local philanthropy to be able to come up with solutions for how we solve for this as our housing crisis continues to grow. One of the ways to do that is you can do it through public-private partnerships, right? You can do it through local jurisdictions, private developers coming together, coming up with an incentive package, and incentivizing the construction of new facilities. Also, through those types of programs, you can incentivize reinvestment in existing facilities, right? Because our older stock of housing is going to just continue to get older unless people reinvest in making it better and up to par and standard, right? So that's important. Philanthropic support, right, for development of new housing. That's critical. Many of you may be familiar with the Regency Lofts, which is right off of 288. And Hasiel, and I think Hasiel, I saw his name somewhere. I know he's not in this room. He runs a great early childhood program that was built in this new development, Regency Loft, which was a 9% tax credit deal. It was a LIHTC funded deal. And on site, they built with the private developer an early childhood center. These partnerships are possible and can happen. It just takes the right collaboration and it takes the right focus to be able to bring it to facility. Or to reality. And so I'll end with this because I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions if I have it. This is some data from McKinsey, the big consulting firm, around where we are in terms of housing between now and 2035. And so what you see here, if you can see this now, I'll kind of explain it. Over here on this next axis, you have 2023 to 2025. This is our housing gap, right? And this is in millions. So as of 2023, we had a housing gap of about 8.2 million houses in the United States. Why is that happening, right? It's between the difference between housing gap growth, right, which is how many houses are being added to the market versus how many new households are needed, right? We have a gap there, so that's adding to it. We need more units for more people experiencing homelessness because we don't have that. That's another 500,000. We need another 0.6 million in order to reach the average vacancy rate, right? We have a lot of communities where there are waiting lists and we don't have enough supply just to have realistic market prices, right? And so we need another 600,000 there. And then to address overcrowding, we need another 3.7 million, right? So what this shows is that we need another 10 million units of housing in this country to really get to a housing affordability spot. And so, right, we're gonna need sustained investments. We're gonna need to integrate housing policy with education and transportation planning, right? And this, I think, is a huge part of this because when we talk about where we build, right, it's only as good as the people who live there can get to work and get to jobs and be able to afford to live where they live, right? It's about looking at how populations are changing in our school systems and building where kids are, right, and making sure that they have access to what they need. And lastly, I think one big thing that we don't have here in the city, and one thing I would advocate for is, and I don't think there's many places that have this, but we need to be able to track in real time who and what is happening in our housing market, right? Like, we need to be able to know what parts of our city have the highest levels of homelessness? Where do we not have sufficient supply in our city, right? Because the developer community is just gonna build where they wanna build, right? A lot of local governments are gonna take whatever they're proposed to by a developer and say, oh, you wanna build? Great, we need housing, go ahead and build it. But unless we align the data with what is actually needed, we're not going to address the problem in the most efficient and effective way. And so, with that being said, I leave you with this question, which is, like, we all have a role to play, and so what role can you play from the lens in which you sit, whether it's, hey, being able to direct kids to resources, whether it's being able to talk to your community partners about, like, hey, what are we doing on the housing front, right? It's just advocacy. What can we do to solve this crisis? So with that, I will end and open up to questions. Yes, sir. Mm. Yeah. I think that's a great question. One thing I'll say, and I think about this a lot, and I had a developer who works on master plan communities tell me this, and it's really interesting. It was just, we have an inherent tension in this country, which is we've built wealth and given access to wealth to families through building housing. However, we have a housing shortage, so you can't have both, right? And what he means by that is that if we build a sufficient amount of housing, then people who have bought housing for purposes of wealth creation lose that access. And for a lot of families, a lot of communities, that's been their only means of building wealth, right? But I think what you're seeing now is a push towards density. You're seeing a push towards different types of zoning laws, getting rid of the NIMBYism that exists, and you're seeing those type of regulatory things coming into play. And I think we're seeing a lot more alignment between local governments realizing this is a problem and wanting to invest in solutions. And so I think that's what I'm seeing. I to be perfectly transparent, I'm not seeing a solution to the 30% issue at this point. I think we're seeing a lot of philanthropy step up, but it's not to the scale, right, that we need. And so that's the part that I'm thinking about, and we're thinking about more with our partners, is just how do we incorporate those units not only just into a development for 30% units, but how do we get them into mixed income units, right? How do we get those families access to good schools, good opportunities, right? And so how do we make sure that there's that socioeconomic integration? That's part of the work that we're focused on at our firm. I know I'm the last person, and it's 12:15, so we should probably end.
We actually have a few more minutes just waiting for the main session to wrap up.
Okay.
So we have plenty of time for questions. Would anyone else have a question for Dr. Hamilton? Okay, we're going to try to do it.
Yeah, some with Neighborhood Schools Work Texas, we run a pre-K partnership hub, and August 2025, we're going to have about 76 pre-K partnerships. These are centers who are lighting up pre-K classrooms in their centers that already exist. And one of the things that's been very interesting, one of the ways that children in Texas qualify for pre-K partnerships is through if they're homeless. And we've seen quite an uptick for us being our 4th year in. We're like, is it an uptick in because of the areas that we're working in, or is it is it that there is truly an uptick in homelessness with people who have the youngest children, right, 0 to 5. And so I wonder, first of all, if there's a place anywhere that has that data specifically with children under 5, and sort of the homelessness epidemic and how it's affecting them, just to kind of so we can educate ourselves going into the communities, right? And we also know, I mean, you mentioned the efforts of planting really great child cares and schools inside of housing complexes. I think it's wonderful work. I've seen a lot of it in Austin, and I'm glad to hear that Harris County's starting to catch on a bit with that, because I think that's a lost opportunity, right? Like there's always that gathering space that's only used once a month or on the weekends or whatever, and there's a grand opportunity there. So just any data y'all have around that. If there are developers maybe that are specifically looking at that, there are gatherings like this of people who are who hold childcare licenses that are on hold right now just because spaces aren't available and things like that. So I just wonder if there's a sort of a clearinghouse for that kind of information.
Yeah, I think a great starting point is the Coalition for the Homeless here in Houston. They do tremendous work and have tremendous data on like where homelessness exists. I think where one issue is a lot of times is that gap between people who build and like people who advocate, right? Like, and how we come up with ways to fill that gap, I think is critical. I think to your point also about integration, we worked on a project, Smart Living at 12th, right? Which was a multifamily project on West 12th Street, kind of near the Heights area, right north of 10. And there's daycare located right at the end of the street. And what we found is that many of the employees qualify for the rent restrictions that we put there, right? And so now they're able to retain employees at a higher rate, right? So even just thinking about where we locate projects, I think that's another way in which we can start to think about, are we putting things near homeless shelters, right? Like, where are we locating these projects so that they can affect families? Yep.
Thank you so much. Anyone else have a question?
First, really loved the presentation. I work with Search Homeless Services at their child care facility, House of Tiny Treasures. We're a free of cost child care center based in 3rd Ward, so shameless plug there. If you want more information on that, please let me know. And you're talking a lot about data, so I just kind of wanted to share a direct resource of what next, how to help in this moment in time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? We have about 5 minutes left in here before we transition downstairs. I just want to make sure the main room has enough time. I'll see if I have any online questions. Okay, awesome.
This is my email. Please email me if you have questions, if you want to talk more about this issue, if you want me to talk to someone else about this issue. Love talking about it. Hopefully I can help get solutions to it, not just talk about it. And so, please reach out if you have questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. Is there a place where people can continue to follow your work, your organization's work, or any other similar organizations that are staying up to date on housing issues?
Yeah, the National Low Income Housing Fund is a tremendous resource in terms of especially how we address and their advocacy at the lower AMI spectrum. our firm, we do work at concentrictax.com. You can visit our website to see some of the projects. We do work across food insecurity. We do a lot of financing for grocery stores and food deserts, kind of figuring out that work. I'm not a big social media person, so unfortunately I don't have like a Twitter handle to give you, but email me, and I'd love to sit down and chat, anyone. Yes, sir. Yes, so we actually are working right now on the deal with the Cesar Chavez Foundation to do a multifamily development south of San Antonio. And so we're working with them on that. And what we find is nonprofit developers, right, they can bring different tools to the table, different levels of equity to the table. They're able to get different lending rates, right? So it makes some of these projects a little bit more viable financially, but yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Can we give Dr. Hamilton another round of applause, please?
Thank you all. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'll just have us stay up here for just a couple more minutes. I just don't want to make the main room too chaotic down there. I will open the doors at that time, but please just feel free to chat, come up to Dr. Hamilton, ask any questions, and just get to know each other. Thank you so much.